Anthony Salerno was born on August 15, 1911. He is known for being the underboss and front boss of the Luciano crime family, later known as the Genovese crime family. And yes, he was known as Fat Tony because he was fat. Salerno grew up in East Harlem and very early in his life became involved in numerous crime operations, not limited to gambling and loan sharking. One particular racket that Salerno was in charge of was said to be bringing in $1 million a year. Salerno was part of a group called the 116th Street Crew led by Michael Coppola, who fled New York when faced with murder charges, leaving Salerno to take over the crew, the instigation to becoming one of the most powerful gangsters in the US for around 40 years. Salerno was, uncharacteristically for a mob boss, very approachable, and many gangsters from all over New York came to him for problems they wanted resolved. He had a relatively low-key lifestyle, never being seen at nightclubs and such, unlike some of the more well-known mobsters of his time. As Salerno's power spread far and wide, his income grew and grew. In the 1960s, he controlled the largest numbers racket in New York, which grossed up to $50 million a year. Almost 20 years later, in 1978, he was charged and sentenced to 6 months in prison for illegal gambling and tax evasion, and in the early 80s suffered a stroke shortly after his release from prison. We know that during the time of his stroke, he had become the underboss of the Genovese crime family. After recovering from his stroke and the death of the boss of the family, Frank Thierry, in 1981, Anthony Salerno became the boss of the family. However, though this is what the FBI thought at the time, we now know that Salerno was merely acting as a front for the true boss of the family, Vincent Gigante. When Vito Genovese died in 1969 and Philip Lombardo took over, Lombardo used many fronts to conceal his real status and therefore lessen the attention from law enforcement. This practice was continued by Gigante when he took over the family when Lombardo died in 1981. In reality, Salerno was demoted to being merely a soldier when Gigante took over the family, though Gigante allowed him to return to his rackets after Salerno began to grow bored. 75-year-old Salerno was one of the mobsters indicted in the famous Mafia Commission trial in 1968. Fortune magazine named him as the top mobster in terms of wealth and power. Because of this, Salerno was the lead defendant in the trial, but it had been suggested that law enforcement exaggerated his importance in order to strengthen possible convictions against him. In the same year, Salerno was convicted on RICO charges and along with 6 other mobsters was punished with 100 years in prison. He was then convicted again in a second racketeering indictment and sentenced to 70 years in prison. During these 2 cases, it had become known to the FBI through informants that Salerno was not as important as they first thought, and that he was simply a front for Gigante. Nevertheless, the 70 years he was sentenced with on separate racketeering charges ensured that Salerno would die in prison, which he did in 1992 of another stroke at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Missouri. Anthony Salerno served as a key inspiration for the Fat Tony character in The Simpsons. He was portrayed by Paul Sorvino in the 2011 gangster movie Kill the Irishman, and will be played by Dominic Lombardozzo in Martin Scorsese's upcoming film The Irishman. Thanks for watching.